Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King's Quest II Romancing the Throne for various PC systems of the late 80s, early 90s. This is the sequel to the original King's Quest, also known as King's Quest I Quest for the Crown, which if you haven't seen my review of that, then there's a link in the top left of this video by annotation. But suffice to say, King's Quest I was groundbreaking for adventure games at the time, and it introduced the graphic adventure to the world, basically. This was the follow-up to that, and it takes place after the events of the original King's Quest, so I do have to use some spoilers from King's Quest I. Nothing really major that you wouldn't know already, just from basically knowing the title of the game and all that. But suffice to say, this is actually closer to what you would see in the original King's Quest, because there was actually no remake for this one. Unlike in the original, which, if you watch my video, you see the SCI remake. This is what the original King's Quest was closer to looking like. And so, as a result, I really don't want to talk much about the visuals. They're pretty much exactly the same in terms of quality and such that the original King's Quest had, but obviously they are adapted to the new setting. So, the real question isn't so much what they did with presentation, because again, it's pretty much exactly the same as the original game, but how did they go about with the rest of the game? Did they take what the original did and improve it, or what? Well, let's start with the storyline, which takes place after the events of the original King's Quest, wherein Graham became the King of Daventry by completing his quest, and eventually he gets this vision from one of the artifacts that he obtained, which was the magic mirror. And the magic mirror shows him this vision of a woman living in this tower. She's locked away in this faraway land. And Graham basically has to go save her. It's a very standard kind of fairy tale trope, and it works out pretty well for the game, actually. It ends up having a lot of charm about it, particularly in how it handles the fairy tale-esque vibe. There's a lot of references to various fairy tales as well as other literature in there. And so it really comes across as this very, I know I use this term a lot with these games, but charming, interesting experience. Because you are sitting there just getting wrapped up in all this fairy tale vibe, and even though the story is very simplistic as far as what you're doing goes, it's still rather engaging and interesting, and you kind of want to see what the game's going to throw at you next. But as far as the gameplay goes, it's pretty much exactly the same as it was in the original King's Quest, only with some different puzzles in there. And what I mean by that is it's still a parser-based adventure game. You still move your character around using the arrow keys and type in commands, and then, of course, press enter to try to use those commands. Like, if you come across a flask, then you want to pick that up. You type in get flask, and he'll pick up the flask if he's close enough to it. Stuff like that. You're still doing that sort of thing. And the puzzles are still somewhat confusing, because, like the original game, it doesn't always tell you exactly what you're supposed to do. You get dropped into Colima, and you don't really know anything about the setting, you don't really know anything about where you're supposed to go, so it can be very confusing at times. And that's one of the main problems I have with this game. Even though the puzzles themselves, once you know the solution, really aren't that hard at all, and you could really figure it out if you thought about it, it's just that initial push is really hard to figure out. You don't get any hints, for the most part, about what you're supposed to do. I mean, if you do get hints, they're very vague. And so, this is another one of those games where, even though it's historically important because it was the follow-up to the original King's Quest, it was one of those very early graphic adventure games, it's still very hard to get into. Unless you were a fan of the original game, or you really like these old-school parser-based adventure games. And you really have to pay a lot of attention to what you're doing. You kind of have to draw out maps for yourself and tell yourself where things are. You still have to write a lot of notes. And it's a very different style of adventure game than a lot of what you saw in the mid to late 90s, and then, of course, in the modern era, with stuff like the Blackwell Deception and such like that. But suffice to say, King's Quest is still a very enjoyable game. King's Quest II, of course. And the problem I have with it, though, is that I still can't recommend it to everybody. because only really graphical adventure game fans are going to like this game. It's one of those things where when you played it back in the day, it just still was kind of mind-boggling. These graphical adventures were still very fresh and new and kind of unheard of before. So just it being a graphical adventure game kind of blew your mind a bit. But once you got into the meat of the game, it was still enjoyable if you were patient with it and you were very methodical and took your time with it. Whereas the more modern gamer is definitely not used to doing that sort of thing. So again, I can't recommend it to everybody, but I can certainly recommend it to fans of adventure games that are looking forward to seeing how the genre has evolved over time. If you're a fan of the King's Quest series and you played the later games but want to get into the earlier games, then again, I can recommend this to you. But it's one of those things where it's very tough to recommend to everyone just because it is so hard to get into. But anyway, I still very much enjoy it, and it's still very much worth playing, especially if you have an interest in this sort of thing. Thanks for watching.